A relationship doesn't usually fail because of one big mistake. It fails because of patterns that feel small in the moment, but compound over time. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the most damaging patterns don't come from bad intentions. They come from habits that feel right while you're doing them. Things that look like love, like care, like effort, but slowly create imbalance, disconnection, and emotional exhaustion. An expert once put it this way: most people don't ruin relationships by what they do wrong, but by what they keep doing without realizing the long-term cost. And that's what makes this dangerous. Because if something feels normal, you don't question it. You repeat it. You defend it. You build your relationship around it. Until one day something feels off, and you can't trace it back to a single moment. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Because the difference between a healthy relationship and a draining one often comes down to subtle behaviors repeated consistently. And once you see them clearly, you start recognizing how they shape everything: communication, attraction, respect, and emotional connection. So instead of asking, "Why did this relationship fail?" the better question is, what patterns made it impossible to succeed? Mistake number 1, over-investing. Too early. At the beginning, everything feels promising. There's chemistry, attention, emotional connection. And naturally, you want to lean into it. You give your time, your energy, your attention, sometimes all at once. You show interest, effort, availability. And on the surface, that seems like the right thing to do, because relationships require investment. But timing matters more than most people realize. When you invest heavily before a foundation is built, you create an imbalance. You're giving based on potential, not consistency. And that shifts the dynamic. Instead of mutual progression, it becomes one person accelerating the connection while the other simply receives it. This doesn't always push someone away immediately. In fact, it can feel good at first. But over time, it reduces tension. And tension is part of what builds attraction. Not anxiety, not games, but the natural pacing of two people discovering each other gradually. When everything is given too quickly, there's less room for curiosity, less space for effort to develop on both sides. And slowly, you might find yourself more invested than the reality of the relationship justifies. Not because you did something wrong, but because you moved faster than the connection had time to stabilize. Mistake number 2, ignoring early discomfort because it's still new. There's a moment in almost every relationship where something feels slightly off. Not a major issue, not a clear red flag, just a small discomfort, a comment that didn't sit right, a behavior that felt inconsistent, a reaction that made you pause for a second longer than usual. And in the beginning, it's easy to dismiss. It's too early to judge. Nobody's perfect? Maybe I'm overthinking. And sometimes that's true. But here's what experts consistently point out. Early discomfort is data. It's your perception picking up on patterns before they fully form. The problem is, when you ignore that signal repeatedly, you don't remove the issue. You delay recognizing it. And by the time it becomes obvious, you're already emotionally involved, which makes it harder to respond objectively. Because now you're not just evaluating behavior, you're protecting the connection you've started building. So instead of addressing the discomfort, you adapt to it. You normalize it. And over time, what once felt off starts feeling familiar. But familiarity doesn't equal compatibility. It just means you've adjusted. And adjustment without awareness is how small issues become defining patterns later on. Mistake number 3, trying to fix him instead of observing him. It often starts with good intentions. You see his potential. You notice where he struggles, where he could grow, what he could become with the right support. And without realizing it, you step into that role. You suggest, guide, encourage, adjust. You try to help him become a better version of himself, not because you want control, but because you care. But here's the problem experts warn about. When you take responsibility for someone else's growth, you stop evaluating who they actually are. You shift from observing behavior to managing it, and that creates a distorted connection. Because instead of relating to the person in front of you, You're relating to a version of them that doesn't fully exist yet. This leads to emotional overinvestment in progress that may never happen. You start measuring the relationship based on improvement instead of reality, and that keeps you in a loop of patience, effort, and hope. But real change doesn't come from external pressure or guidance. It comes from internal decision. If someone wants to grow, they will. Consistently, independently, and without needing to be managed. And if they don't, no amount of support will create lasting change. So when you find yourself trying to fix someone, it's often a sign that you're not fully accepting what's already being shown. Mistake number 4. Communicating indirectly, instead of clearly not. All communication problems come from saying the wrong thing. Sometimes they come from not saying things directly enough. You hint, you imply. You expect him to notice changes in your tone, your energy, your behavior, and understand what they mean without you having to explain it. And when he doesn't, it creates frustration. Because from your perspective, it feels obvious. But from his, it's unclear. This creates a gap between intention and interpretation. You believe you're expressing something. He doesn't fully receive it, and that leads to misalignment. Over time, this pattern builds quiet resentment. You feel unheard. He feels confused. And both of you start reacting to a version of the situation that isn't fully accurate. Experts point out that clarity is one of the most undervalued skills in relationships. Not harshness, not confrontation, just direct, honest communication. Saying what you mean without expecting the other person to decode it. Because when communication relies on interpretation instead of clarity, small misunderstandings turn into larger issues. And the longer they go unresolved, the more they shape how both people experience the relationship. Clarity doesn't guarantee agreement, but it prevents confusion. And confusion is where most unnecessary problems begin. Mistake number 5. Losing your own life inside the relationship. At the beginning, balance exists naturally. You have your routines, your interests, your friendships, your own structure, and the relationship fits into that life. But over time, something can shift. You start prioritizing the relationship more and more, adjusting your schedule, rearranging your time, letting certain parts of your life fade into the background, not intentionally, but gradually. And eventually, the relationship stops being part of your life and starts becoming most of it. This can feel like commitment, like dedication, like you're doing what relationships require. But experts consistently highlight this as a critical mistake, because attraction doesn't grow in environments where individuality disappears. When your world becomes smaller, the dynamic changes. You become more available, more focused, more dependent on the relationship for emotional fulfillment. And that creates pressure, not always visible, but felt. Healthy relationships don't replace your life. They integrate with it. They add to it, not consume it. Because your independence isn't a threat to connection, it's part of what sustains it. When you maintain your own structure, your own identity, your own sources of fulfillment, the relationship stays balanced. But when everything starts revolving around it, that balance fades. And once it's gone, it's difficult to rebuild. Mistake number 6. Accepting inconsistent effort and calling it normal. Not every relationship starts perfectly balanced. Sometimes one person invests a little more at the beginning. That's normal. But what experts consistently warn about is what happens when that imbalance stays. When effort becomes inconsistent, when attention, time, and presence fluctuate, and instead of questioning it, you adapt to it. You tell yourself it's just how relationships are, that people get busy, that things naturally cool down. And while that can be true in moderation, consistent inconsistency is not normal. It's a pattern. And patterns shape expectations. You start adjusting your standards to match what's being given. You accept less communication, less effort, less clarity, because it's easier than confronting the imbalance. But over time, this creates a one-sided dynamic. One person sets the level of investment. The other learns to live within it. And that slowly erodes both attraction and respect. Because effort isn't just about what someone does. It reflects how they prioritize the connection. When effort is steady, it builds trust. When it's unpredictable, it creates doubt. And if you normalize that unpredictability, you're not protecting the relationship. You're lowering the standard it's built on. Mistake number 7, staying too long, hoping it will go back to the beginning. Almost every relationship has a phase where everything feels right, easy, natural, connected. And when things start to change, when tension appears, when behavior shifts, when the dynamic feels different, it's tempting to hold on to that earlier version, to believe that if you just try a little harder, communicate a little better, or give it more time, things will go back to how they were. But this is one of the most powerful traps, because you're no longer responding to the present, you're attached to the past. You measure the relationship not by how it consistently feels now, but by how good it once felt. And that keeps you invested in restoring something instead of evaluating what currently exists. Experts call this anchoring to the peak. You lock onto the best version of the relationship and use it as a reference point, even if it's no longer the reality. But relationships don't sustain themselves on memories. They function on patterns. And if the current pattern doesn't match what you're hoping for, time alone won't fix that. Because time doesn't create change, behavior does. So the real question isn't, can it go back? It's, is what exists now something I can genuinely accept long-term? And that answer requires honesty most people avoid. When you look at all of these mistakes together, a pattern becomes clear. None of them come from a lack of care. In fact, most of them come from too much care, applied in the wrong direction, over-investing, over-understanding, over-adjusting, trying to preserve the connection at the cost of your own clarity. And that's what makes them so easy to fall into. Because they don't feel like mistakes while you're making them. They feel like effort, like patience, like love. But love without awareness can create imbalance just as quickly as neglect. Because relationships don't just respond to intention, they respond to patterns. And patterns don't change unless they're recognized. This is where things shift. When you stop focusing only on how you feel and start paying attention to what's consistently happening. Not the promises, not the potential, but the repeated behaviors that define the dynamic. Because once you see those clearly, you stop guessing. You stop overcompensating. You start making decisions based on reality, not hope. And that changes everything. Here's the part most people don't hear enough. Avoiding these mistakes isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming aware. Aware of pacing, of patterns, of how your actions shape the dynamic just as much as his do. Because a healthy relationship isn't something you force into place. It's something that develops when both people are aligned in effort, clarity, and intention. When you invest at a pace that matches reality. When you pay attention to early signals instead of dismissing them. When you communicate directly instead of indirectly. When you maintain your identity instead of losing it. When you hold standards instead of adjusting them downward. These aren't rules, they're stabilizers. They prevent you from building something on imbalance. And once those stabilizers are in place, something shifts. You stop chasing connection and start recognizing it. You stop trying to make something work and start seeing whether it naturally does. And that difference is what separates relationships that feel draining from ones that actually feel sustainable. If any of these mistakes made you stop and think, don't ignore that. Comment below which ones stood out to you the most. And if you want more breakdowns like this, real patterns, real psychology, no filters, make sure to subscribe. Because the next thing we're going to break down might completely change how you approach relationships.